This is our accessibility audit for our Intro to Disability Studies class. My name is Kendall Cassell.
I'm Catherine Arith.
I'm Sarah Fafaro.
And I'm Jay Izzo.
And so for our project, we audited Hughes Hall and Collins Hall, both on Fordham's Rose Hill campus. So our initial observation for Hughes was a few issues with the ramp they have. It's wide and easily accessible from the road and the sidewalk, but there's this plant right there that narrows the ramp and makes it more difficult to actually enter the building. And we thought for here, it was kind of the university prioritizing aesthetic over accessibility, as the planter doesn't really need to be there and only just looks nice. The classrooms and restrooms are fairly accessible. The door frames are narrow and they have no automatic button in order to let someone in a wheelchair or who has more difficulty walking in. They must be 32 inches wide to meet the standards for the ADA. So while they do, there's definitely room for improvement. As well as we looked at the emergency procedure plans in Hughes. So there's very little information about how people in wheelchairs or who have more difficulty using the stairs are supposed to leave the building during an emergency. By these back stairs in Hughes, there's an area that's noted as the area of rescue assistance, but here there's no contact information or emergency procedure information. So it's actually unknown how the person should be rescued, who to contact if they need to be rescued, or where to go from here. And while some people who are on campus often may know this information, guests may not, and it's important to prioritize everyone being aware. Finally, Hughes is not listed on Fordham's website as being accessible. Hughes was renovated in 2012, so either this website is very, very outdated or something just needs to be done. It's been accessible for a while and should be noted for people visiting campus.
So for our recommendations, our first recommendation is to remove the planter on the ramp. This would allow for wheelchairs to be able to easily access the front of the building without an obstacle. And this photo is taken originally in October when we first did the accessibility audit. And then next slide, please. This photo is taken in December. So we recently spoke to Mr. John Puglisi, and he is the Associate Director of Facilities. And he mainly told us that, the reason why the planter was there is because of the aesthetic. It makes the aesthetic of the building look nice. And Mr. Puglisi is really focused on making everything accessible, while his boss is really focused on making everything look nice and making sure it's pretty. So when we met with him, he told us he was going to have the planter removed. So we went to go check on it. And unfortunately, after our meeting, it was not removed. And there were, in fact, 2 planters. So hopefully in the future, he can contact facilities maybe once the spring semester starts and everyone's back on campus, and we can have these planters removed so the wheelchairs could easily get up the ramp and access the building. Our second recommendation is to have more signs explaining where the people in wheelchairs or if they have mobility issues to go if there is an emergency. We also believe that having a sign near the elevator instructing, where the stairs are in Hughes. The stairs in Hughes are kind of hidden. They're kind of on the side, so you may not know where the stairs are if there was an emergency situation. So having a sign by the elevator would probably be very helpful because, people would want to go to the elevator in case of an emergency to get out of the building, but obviously you shouldn't be going in an elevator if there is an emergency in the building. So having this clearly labeled would be really helpful to people with mobility issues. Our last recommendation for Hughes Hall is to update the website. Fordham should include that Hughes is accessible. And, if a student is applying to Fordham and they have mobility issues and they want to be in the Gabelli School of Business, they should include this on the website so that applying students and current students can know that they can access Hughes. They should also highlight on the website that, the ramp is on the face of the building that is facing McGinley Center. And they should also highlight the area of rescue for assistance near the stairs. So that way, if, a student with mobility issues is in the building a lot, they will know and be aware of the emergency situation in that building.
So the second building that we audited was Collins Hall. And we also talked with John Puglisi about this building as well. So there's a new ramp that allows access to the front of the building, and this was part of a recent renovation that also included the addition of an elevator, which I'll get to in a minute. The ramp is not as wide as it maybe could be, but it is still, just about wide enough for a wheelchair. The position of the front door makes entrance into the building from the ramp a little bit difficult. You have to kind of maneuver around it a little bit. And that's because the door that opens with the automatic door opening button swings outwards towards the ramp, as you can see in the picture there. When we talked to John Puglisi about this, he mentioned that what prompted this renovation was that it was kind of a priority on the list of buildings that needed to be renovated because there was no way to get into it from the outside, and vertical transportation is always a concern. And there were two buildings that did not have elevators, and that was Collins and Cuniff House. And he was focused a lot on student activities, and students do more in Collins as the theater is there and the philosophy department is there. So that's what really prompted this particular renovation. Okay. So the Collins Hall elevator was on the inside of the building, which is actually great because a lot of buildings that were not originally built with elevators, the only way to get an elevator in there is to do it from the outside. At least that's what Mr. Puglisi told us. So it was really great that they were actually able to fit it inside. He said ideally there would be two in case one breaks down, but for now, one is better than nothing. The buttons on the elevator did have Braille on them, which is nice, but the elevator did not go to the top two floors. And the entrance was a little bit narrow, but wide enough.
So the elevator, as we talked about, it had access to the second floor where there are bathrooms. However, the bathrooms are not adequately accommodating because there are many narrow doorways. As you can see by the pictures in the bottom left, the doorway is narrow, the stalls are very narrow. There's very little room for wheelchair navigation. And in the picture in the bottom left of the interior, you can see that there's a trash can placed in front of the hand towels, which can also limit accessibility. When we talked to Mr. Puglisi, he acknowledged that there were definitely problems with the bathrooms, but the priority of the Collins renovation was really getting in the ramp and the elevator. As was mentioned, he said that the standard for Fordham is, or at least the goal is to have 2 elevators in every building. So just getting this first elevator in was the first step into full accessibility. And we can continue to the next slide. Furthermore, with the bathrooms, the elevator does have access to the basement, and there are bathrooms in the basement. However, as you can see with the photograph to the furthest left, there are a set of a few stairs that go down to these bathrooms. And again, these bathrooms, much like the ones on the second floor, have very little interior space for mobility, especially for wheelchairs. In addition to that, the hand dryer's a little high up on the wall, which could make it difficult for someone who's, again, say in a wheelchair. But like Mr. Puglisi said, the fact that these bathrooms are not fully accessible doesn't mean that Fordham is not going to try and change them one day. He says that that is a project for a future day, and that the next time that Collins is renovated, specifically with access to, we can go to the next slide, the theater, because the theater is not completely accessible. I mean, there are spots in the audience where people with wheelchairs can sit, and because of the elevator, they do have access to it. The theater is located on the second floor, which the elevator does have access to. And aside from that, the problem is that in terms of getting on the stage, there are only stairs. If someone had some challenges with mobility and they wanted to be involved in student activities that involve the theater, it is a bit of an exclusive environment. So Mr. Puglisi says that hopefully one day, when Fordham goes back to renovate the theater, at the same time they can get the bathrooms on the second floor in the basement. But for the most recent renovation, their primary goal was the elevator and the ramp. So we did ask him why the elevator doesn't go to the top 2 floors. And he said that that was a result of a compromise made with the groups that the offices that are inhabiting the top 2 floors, and how they didn't want to have to how the construction would have been very invasive to their work environment. And we asked him about why that perhaps, if that may perhaps pose any problems to the future. And he said in response to that, at the end of the day, the most important part of the renovation was getting the elevator shaft into the first couple floors, so that adding an addition to it would not be nearly as expensive or time consuming as getting the initial elevator in. Just as a side note, we did ask him if Collins had any historic protections that interfered with how perhaps the elevator construction had to be done. And to our surprise, there actually were not. Collins does not have any historic landmark protection that Fordham has to abide by in accordance to the state. So in terms of putting an elevator in or renovations, there's a lot more freedom than if it were a historic landmark. So we can continue to the next slide.
So going on about the theater, the backstage was also not accessible at all. As you can see in the picture, the steps were very steep. There were a lot of them, and it was also very cramped backstage. And this is something that John Puglisi did mention, that he would like to in the future make the stage itself and the backstage more accessible. But the recent renovation of the ramp and the elevator were just kind of the first step to that. So our recommendations for Collins Hall, our first one is that the door access button at the top of the ramp needs to open a door that's easier to enter. So preferably the door opposite the ramp instead of the one right next to it. And when we asked Mr. Puglisi about this, he said that it was mainly because that was the door that was easiest to connect to that button. And that's just the way the door was installed. And he said that, while it may not be optimal, it is still possible to get into the building, which I think the general theme of this renovation is that it's better than it was before. And it's kind of a first step towards making the building accessible.
So in addition to that, as mentioned, the bathrooms need to be made more accessible, specifically to those in wheelchairs, such as implementing wider doors, wider stalls, having the sinks and the towels accessible to those in wheelchairs. And again, the basement bathrooms are only accessible by a few stairs down, which could pose a problem. And again, Mr. Puglisi said that that is on Fordham's radar, that they are aware of it, and they do hope to remedy that in the future. But that was not the plan of the most recent renovation, which again, that was mainly for the elevator and the ramp.
So then so of course that the elevator should go to the top 2 floors. Jay already mentioned that because of the STEP program office on the top floor, that declined the elevator going up there because of the noise and the issues the construction would cause, that was the main reason. And hopefully in the future, the elevator will be able to go up to those floors.
Yeah, and then finally, we recommend that a ramp up to the backstage or to the stage and have wider space back there would allow for a lot more accessibility for students who have mobility problems and are involved with the theater organizations in Collins Hall. Now, again, this is on Fordham's radar, and there's definitely a hope to have that renovated in the future. So that's definitely good.
Yeah. And then one more thing that I forgot to mention about the ramp is that Mr. Puglisi did mention that a chairlift was an option, and that would be in a place where the automatic door wouldn't so much be in the way, but they decided to just keep the ramp because ramps don't break down nearly as easily, and apparently chairlifts do quite often. So that's kind of why that decision was made as well.
Okay, and do we have any more slides? I believe that is the conclusion of our presentation. Okay, yeah, so that was our accessibility audit on Collins and Hughes, and again, big thanks to Mr. John Puglisi for meeting with us and answering our questions. And we're glad that Fordham is always looking forward to creating a more accessible environment.